In the glittering heart of London, winter's frost clung to the edges of the Queen's palace like a delicate lace. Inside, the ballroom shimmered under the glow of hundreds of crystal chandeliers, their prisms scattering light across marble floors and gilded walls. Musicians tuned violins and harps, the delicate tension of strings weaving anticipation through the crowd. Yet, amid the swirl of silks, taffetas, and whispers, one figure lingered at the margin, a presence so quiet that even the most observant of society's elites might have overlooked her entirely. She was Lady Eleanor Whitmore, the woman who, for a decade, had been spoken of only in whispers, as a cautionary tale, a fated debutante, a forgotten lady whose beauty and promise had been buried beneath scandal and the relentless judgment of London society. Her entrance had been almost imperceptible, a hush accompanying the soft rustle of her sapphire gown, the color of winter's deepest twilight. The gown had once belonged to her late mother, stitched with painstaking care and lined with the faint scent of lavender that still clung stubbornly to the silk. Eleanor's dark brown hair, tamed in an elegant knot, framed a face that had learned restraint and quiet endurance. Her eyes, however, told a different story, deep pools of tempered sorrow that still glimmered with the embers of hope. Each step she took was measured, a careful negotiation with the countless eyes that might still judge, whisper, or condemn. Society had not been kind. For 10 long years, Eleanor had borne the invisible weight of disgrace, her name murmured in scandalous gossip at salons and dinner parties. The broken engagement that had promised her a future of comfort and status left her adrift, a vessel carried by currents she could neither control nor escape. She had learned to move with a quiet dignity, to smile with restraint, to answer the barbed compliments and covert insults with the faintest lift of a gloved hand. In the grand hall, surrounded by dancers and mask-wearing courtiers, Eleanor appeared almost spectral, a figure caught between memory and present. Her presence was a testament to survival, to endurance, to the fragile beauty of a woman who refused to vanish completely. From across the room, a murmur arose, soft but sharp as a blade. Lady Beatrice Montrose, once a companion of Eleanor's in childhood, now a master of society's cruel games, inclined her head with a subtle, mocking grace. Her voice, carrying just enough for the nearest listeners to hear, whispered, "How quaint that the forgotten lady dares to step among the living again." Eleanor felt her spine stiffen, her hands clenching slightly at her sides. She had long anticipated such venom, yet the sting never dulled. She allowed only the smallest quiver of a breath to betray the turmoil beneath her composed exterior. It was then that the air shifted, as though the ballroom itself sensed an approaching storm. The Duke of Ravensshire entered. Edmund Cavendish, known across England not only for his wealth and estates, but for a heart considered impenetrable, a man feared for duels and whispered ruthlessness. A hush fell like a curtain, the dancers pausing mid-step, the laughter suspended in the air. He moved with deliberate grace, a tall figure in emerald velvet, the cut of his coat precise, his cravat perfectly aligned. Every inch of him bore the mark of command, of authority, of a man who had never been swayed by beauty, flattery, or charm. Yet when his gaze swept the room, it halted on Eleanor, lingering as if struck by some invisible force. For 20 seconds, time seemed to slow. The chatter of courtiers dimmed, the melody of violins softened to a whisper. The Duke's eyes, normally sharp and calculating, softened, narrowed, and widened all at once, betraying a rare, unguarded astonishment. Eleanor felt the weight of his scrutiny, and for a fleeting heartbeat, she experienced a sensation long foreign to her, being truly seen, not for scandal, not for past missteps, but for the woman she was beneath the layers of judgment. She kept her gaze averted, though a subtle tremor in her fingers betrayed her growing awareness that something significant had shifted. The orchestra's strings resumed their delicate harmony, and the world slowly exhaled. Yet in that brief collision of glances, Eleanor understood that her life, long confined to the shadows of whispered shame, had just encountered a force that might overturn all she had learned to accept. The Duke approached with measured steps, each one echoing softly against the marble. Society held its breath, sensing the unspoken significance of the encounter, though no word had yet passed between them. Eleanor's heart beat a steady rhythm beneath her bodice, a reminder that she was alive, capable of both fear and hope. Her mind raced with questions she had long suppressed. Why had he looked at her this way? What did he see that no one else had for 10 long years? The answers were not clear, but the implications were undeniable. The man who had never been swayed by beauty or charm now appeared moved, affected in ways society would find impossible to understand. Eleanor's body remained poised, yet a subtle warmth crept to her cheeks, the tiniest acknowledgement that she, too, felt something stir within her. Society, oblivious to the profound exchange that had just occurred, continued its dance of gossip and pretense. Yet Eleanor could not return to invisibility. She was, in that moment, a fulcrum upon which attention and curiosity balanced precariously. Even the subtle mockery of Lady Beatrice now seemed almost irrelevant, drowned by the quiet intensity of the Duke's gaze and the possibilities it heralded. A quiet revolution had begun in Eleanor's heart, a fragile, tentative hope that the past 10 years of solitude and shame might, at last, yield to something unforeseen. As the night wore on, Eleanor retreated to the edge of the ballroom, her thoughts a whirl of fear, curiosity, and reluctant anticipation. The Duke remained across the room, a distant yet undeniable presence, commanding attention without uttering a word. The clock ticked, the dancers moved, the whispers continued. Yet Eleanor felt the first tremors of change. Something significant had been set in motion, though its nature remained uncertain. By the time the masquerade reached its crescendo, Eleanor understood one immutable truth. The world she had inhabited for 10 years, a world of whispers, exclusion, and quiet suffering, had just intersected with a force she could not ignore. The Duke of Ravensshire, feared and untouchable, had glimpsed the forgotten lady and, in 20 silent seconds, shattered his own carefully constructed boundaries. Eleanor's future, uncertain and precarious as it was, now held the fragile promise of something greater, something that might demand courage, resilience, and the boldest step she had ever taken in her life. The night ended not with music or applause, but with a single, lingering sense of possibility, the kind that sweeps through the soul like a winter wind through the empty streets of London. Eleanor, poised and composed to all who watched, carried within her the first spark of hope she had allowed herself in a decade. The Duke had seen her, and in being seen, Eleanor began to understand that the shadows of the past, long cast over her life, might finally yield to light. In the days following the Queen's winter masquerade, London salons buzzed with speculation, a web of whispers weaving itself through gilded drawing rooms and candlelit corridors. The name of Lady Eleanor Whitmore, once resigned to obscurity, now danced on the lips of the elite with a mixture of curiosity and incredulity. That a woman so long forgotten could attract the attention of the Duke of Ravensshire, a man whose reputation for disdain and indifference was legendary, ignited a storm of gossip that neither she nor her family had anticipated. Yet Eleanor, accustomed to the sting of society's scrutiny, met the murmurs with a measured grace. She understood that survival demanded composure, even as her heart betrayed her with a nervous flutter each time a carriage rolled past her window or a servant whispered of a passing comment made by a well-placed observer. It was in this fragile interlude of heightened attention that a letter arrived, its seal bearing the unmistakable insignia of Ravensshire Hall. Eleanor's hand, gloved and steady, trembled slightly as she broke the wax, revealing a page of immaculate handwriting. The words were courteous, precise, and entirely unexpected, an invitation to visit the Duke at his estate under the pretense of discussing a charitable foundation she had once sponsored for widowed women. Society, as always, would interpret the gesture in the most scandalous of ways, but Eleanor's mind, sharpened by years of vigilance, immediately recognized the subtle weight beneath the civility. The Duke was testing her, reaching across the chasm of rumor and fear, offering an opportunity cloaked in propriety. Her aunt, a woman both wise and cautious, pressed her hand to Eleanor's shoulder, murmuring a warning that carried the weight of experience. "Remember, my dear, the Duke's reputation is formidable. He may flatter, he may intrigue, but London watches, and the wrong step could undo all your careful restoration." Eleanor inclined her head, acknowledging the counsel with a faint smile. Her eyes, however, betrayed a spark that had long been dormant. The notion of stepping into Ravenshire Hall, of confronting the man whose gaze had unsettled her so completely, ignited a quiet thrill that she struggled to suppress. The past 10 years of meticulous invisibility suddenly seemed a fragile, constraining shroud, ready to be cast aside by courage, curiosity, or perhaps something yet unnamed. The carriage that carried her to Ravenshire Hall rolled through fog-laden streets, each wheel's rhythm echoing her pulse. The estate emerged from the mist, imposing yet inviting, a testament to wealth and power tempered by careful taste. Eleanor's heart quickened as she ascended the steps, each footfall deliberate, each breath measured. When the doors opened, she found herself in a hall vast and ornate, adorned with portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her every move, their gazes a silent judgment of lineage and propriety. And there, at the far end of the hall, stood the Duke, his posture impeccable, his expression one of controlled curiosity. He greeted her not with the formal bow of society, but with a measured inclination of the head, a subtle acknowledgment that he recognized her as a woman who bore both dignity and history. Their conversation began with the delicate protocols of philanthropy, a discussion of widows, of charitable endowments, of the responsibilities that came with wealth. Yet beneath each carefully chosen word flowed a current of unspoken significance. The Duke's questions, though polite, carried the weight of personal interest. His gaze lingered in ways that demanded Eleanor's awareness. And Eleanor, for her part, answered with measured candor, revealing just enough to establish intelligence and compassion without surrendering the privacy she had so meticulously preserved. In these exchanges, a subtle intimacy began to take root, a silent negotiation of trust and intrigue that neither could yet articulate in words. At length, the Duke presented her with a small object, wrapped in soft velvet and sealed with his personal crest. Eleanor's fingers brushed against the fabric, revealing a sapphire brooch, identical in hue to the gown she had worn at the Masquerade. The gesture was understated, yet it carried the weight of attention, memory, and intent. "A reminder," he said quietly, "that some things, though long hidden, are never truly forgotten." Eleanor accepted it with a bow, her pulse quickened not by the value of the jewel, but by the acknowledgment it represented. She understood that this was no mere token of courtesy. It was an unspoken statement, a challenge to the judgments of society, and an invitation to reconsider her own place in a world that had long dismissed her. As she departed Ravenshire Hall, the carriage gliding through the night's fog, Eleanor felt the strange exhilaration of a life momentarily suspended. The streets, familiar yet altered by the lens of possibility, seemed both threatening and promising. She knew the whispers of London would grow louder, that the scandal of her association with the Duke would be dissected and debated. Yet she also recognized a deeper truth, that she was no longer entirely subject to society's dictates, that a force greater than rumor, a man's genuine interest, however unexpected, had entered her orbit. The brooch rested over her heart, a weight both literal and figurative, marking the first tangible sign that her long years of obscurity might yield to recognition and, perhaps, to affection. Back in the drawing rooms of London, the reaction was swift. Lady Beatrice, ever vigilant in her scrutiny, remarked to a circle of acquaintances that the forgotten lady had received the Duke's attention, a subtle insinuation, yet one that carried the sting of envy and derision. Eleanor, however, had anticipated such commentary. She met it not with anger, but with calm acknowledgement, understanding that the eyes of society, though persistent and critical, could no longer dictate the measure of her worth. In this realization, a quiet empowerment took root. She could navigate the currents of gossip, confront the whispers of judgment, and emerge with dignity intact. Within Ravenshire Hall, the Duke reflected on the encounter with a mixture of admiration and frustration. He had seen many women, attended countless balls, and endured the relentless pursuit of flattery and desire. Yet Eleanor Whitmore had unsettled him in ways he had not anticipated. Her composure, her restraint, her intelligence, and the faint, unyielding spark in her eyes pierced the layers of indifference he had built around himself. For the first time, he contemplated not conquest, but curiosity, not admiration from afar, but a desire to engage, to know, to unravel the complexity that society had long misjudged. By the time the week drew to a close, the ripples of that single visit had spread far beyond the walls of Ravenshire Hall. Eleanor, once resigned to anonymity, now found herself at the nexus of fascination and rumor. And though she would not admit it aloud, nor allow herself the indulgence of certainty, she sensed that a delicate, profound transformation had begun. In a world where appearances often dictated reality, the collision of two steadfast wills, one shaped by endurance, the other by reputation, had initiated a narrative neither could ignore. As the streets of London slipped into the quiet of a frost-laden night, Eleanor contemplated the days to come. She knew the challenges, the scrutiny, the potential for heartbreak. Yet she also understood that the opportunity offered by the Duke was singular, unprecedented, and fraught with possibility. And as the candlelight flickered against the walls of her chamber, she allowed herself the faintest acknowledgement of hope, a fragile ember kindled by the recognition of worth, attention, and perhaps something deeper still. The story, poised on the precipice of scandal, intrigue, and awakening desire, was far from concluded. The delicate tension of propriety and emotion would soon demand resolution. The quiet dance of reputation and genuine feeling set into motion a series of events that neither Lady Eleanor nor the Duke could entirely predict. Yet one truth had already crystallized in her mind. She was no longer the forgotten lady of London. She had been seen, acknowledged, and remembered, and the consequences of that recognition would alter the course of her life in ways both terrifying and wondrous. The rain fell in persistent sheets upon Ravenshire Hall, tapping against the broad windows with a rhythm both relentless and soothing. Inside, the vast drawing room glowed with the warmth of a roaring fire, its flames casting trembling shadows across polished wood and crimson draperies. Lady Eleanor Whitmore stood near the hearth, gloved hands folded in front of her, her sapphire gown clinging gently to her frame as if reluctant to release the weight of memory and expectation. She had arrived under the pretense of discussing charitable matters once more, yet the tension between them pulsed with a force she could neither ignore nor fully comprehend. The storm outside seemed a mirror to the turbulence within, the wind's howl carrying whispers that mingled with the unspoken truths of their meeting. The Duke of Ravenshire entered silently, his presence commanding yet tempered by a rare restraint. Edmund Cavendish, feared across England for duels, fortune, and an unyielding temperament, now appeared diminished in the shadow of the woman he had so recently observed, so keenly noted, and so quietly revered. He approached with measured steps, his gaze fixed upon Eleanor with an intensity that could both disarm and illuminate. It was as though the distance of years, the veil of gossip, and the weight of society's judgment had all dissolved in the span of a single, steady look. "Lady Eleanor," he began, his voice low yet imbued with a gravity that drew her attention entirely, "I fear London speaks of us with a recklessness that dishonors more than it informs. And yet, I must confess that my own attention has not been careless." His words hung in the air, deliberate, revealing, and yet leaving room for interpretation. Eleanor's pulse quickened, a rhythm that matched the storm beyond the windows. She had endured 10 years of whispers, Yet the directness of the Duke's voice unsettled her in ways both frightening and exhilarating. "Your Grace," she replied, maintaining the composure that had carried her through a decade of exile from favor. "I am unaccustomed to such directness. Society expects restraint, and I have long cultivated it." There was a softness beneath her words, a vulnerability that the Duke's eyes captured without need for elaboration. Every glance, every pause, carried volumes that etiquette would have demanded be silent. She was aware, as he was, that the room contained more than firelight. It contained a tension neither could entirely name, a delicate balance between propriety and private yearning. The Duke's expression softened, though the shadows of formality lingered. "You have endured much, Eleanor, and yet you stand before me with a dignity that mocks the cruelties of this city. Tell me, do you regret the years lost to whispers and abandonment?" His question, though carefully phrased, pierced deeper than any accusation or rumor could. Eleanor's throat tightened. The memory of her broken engagement, of family disappointment, of nights spent in solitary reflection, rose like a tide she had long suppressed. "I have learned survival," she answered quietly, eyes fixed upon the dancing flames, and the careful art of invisibility. But survival does not heal the heart entirely. The world's judgment leaves its mark, and its memory lingers. Her voice trembled almost imperceptibly, the first crack in the armor she had spent a decade perfecting. The Duke stepped closer, closing the measured distance between them, yet respecting the boundaries her posture insisted upon. His hand hovered near the brooch he had given her, a subtle acknowledgment of memory and intent. "Then allow me," he said, voice softening further, "to offer a measure of repair. Not for society, not for appearances, but for the woman who has endured in silence." There was a weight to his words, a deliberate acknowledgment that this was no idle compliment, no superficial gesture. Eleanor turned her gaze to meet his, and in that instant, the world contracted around them, leaving only two people suspended in the quiet storm of candlelight, rain, and unspoken possibility. The conversation unfolded, layer upon layer, like the careful folding of a letter meant for a single confidant. Eleanor spoke of her charitable endeavors, of the women she had aided, of the subtle ways she sought to reclaim purpose amid exile from favor. The Duke listened, each subtle nod, each careful intonation revealing that he was not merely hearing her words, but understanding their weight, their intent, their hidden courage. In the privacy of the room, free from society's eyes and the murmur of rumor, a fragile intimacy began to form, as though each syllable shared were a stitch binding two previously isolated hearts. At length, Eleanor, emboldened by the gravity of their dialogue, dared to ask the question that had haunted her since the masquerade. "Why, Your Grace, have you pursued me so deliberately, when London has spent a decade forgetting me?" The Duke's gaze held hers, unwavering, and a faint trace of a smile curved his lips. "Because 20 seconds changed everything," he said simply, the conviction in his tone leaving no room for doubt. "In that brief encounter, I recognized a truth I had long avoided, that strength, dignity, and grace are far more compelling than flattery, and far more dangerous than rumor. You have awakened a part of me that I believed buried, and I cannot deny it." Eleanor's chest swelled with a mixture of fear, hope, and disbelief. The Duke, for all his fearsome reputation, was revealing not arrogance, but vulnerability, a crack in the armor of indifference that had shielded him from emotion for so many years. She realized that he, too, had been constrained by past losses, by expectation, and by the relentless gaze of society. In acknowledging her worth, he was acknowledging his own humanity, a revelation that stirred the embers of trust she had thought long extinguished. As the evening wore on, the rain softened, a gentle patter replacing the earlier storm's insistence. The firelight cast their shadows along the walls, long and intertwined, as if the room itself recognized the significance of the moment. The Duke produced another small token, a delicate leather-bound journal, unassuming yet rich in sentiment. "For your thoughts, your reflections," he said quietly, "so that the world outside may not dictate the measure of your days." Eleanor accepted it with reverence, aware that this gesture, while subtle, bore a weight that society would never comprehend. It was a declaration of respect, of attention, of intention, a private acknowledgement that her life mattered in ways the public I had long denied. Their conversation tapered into comfortable silence, each lost in reflection, yet acutely aware of the proximity, of the gravity, of the unspoken currents flowing between them. The Duke, once untouchable, seemed softened by her presence, while Eleanor, long practiced in the art of concealment, allowed herself small moments of unguarded awareness. They had crossed a threshold, one measured not in public gestures or grand declarations, but in the private intimacy of recognition, empathy, and mutual respect. As the clock chimed late into the night, Eleanor rose to depart. The Duke accompanied her to the hall, and, at the threshold, he spoke in a voice that trembled slightly despite its usual control. "The world will speak, Eleanor. Let it. But know this, the moments we share in truth, the words unspoken to society, are ours alone, and they're more powerful than any whisper or rumor." She nodded, a faint smile curving her lips, understanding that this was not a promise of love yet, but the foundation of it, trust, acknowledgement, and the quiet thrill of possibility. When Eleanor returned to her chambers, the journal resting upon her writing desk, she allowed herself the faintest glimmer of hope, a fragile ember nurtured by the evening's revelations. She understood that the path ahead would not be without scrutiny, nor free from the echoes of judgment. Yet she also realized that the Duke's regard, his attention, and his subtle gestures had begun to rewrite the narrative that society had imposed upon her. The storm outside had passed, leaving the air crisp and filled with the scent of renewal. Within her, a storm of a different kind had begun, one of courage, longing, and the tentative stirrings of affection that could not be ignored. The night ended on the quiet promise of what was to come, a delicate tension suspended in candlelight, rain, and the knowledge that both Eleanor and the Duke had glimpsed the possibility of a future neither could have anticipated. Society, with all its cruelty, could wait. For the first time in 10 years, Eleanor Whitmore felt the fragile exhilaration of being seen not for scandal, not for past mistakes, but for the woman she truly was, and the man who in 20 seconds had altered the course of both their lives. Spring had arrived at Ravenshire Hall, softening the edges of winter's harsh austerity with gentle sunlight and the scent of budding roses. The estate's gardens were alive with color. Yet it was the ballroom that awaited the culmination of whispered anticipation, a place where the public eye and private truth would finally converge. The Ravenshire Charity Ball had been announced in Eleanor Whitmore's honor, an event orchestrated with meticulous care to celebrate the work she had undertaken for widows and the disenfranchised, but also, unbeknownst to society at large, to honor the woman who had captured the Duke's attention and unsettled his famously unshakable heart. Eleanor prepared with a mixture of trepidation and resolve. Her sapphire gown, a timeless legacy of her mother, shimmered beneath the candlelight, every fold and seam a testament to grace, poise, and the quiet defiance of one who had long been dismissed. Her dark hair, arranged with care and adorned with a simple silver comb, framed a face that spoke of intelligence, resilience, and the subtle allure of someone who had endured hardship yet remained unbroken. The brooch the Duke had gifted her, pinned over her heart, seemed almost luminous, as if reflecting the unspoken promise of the evening. The Duke of Ravenshire, for his part, moved through the corridors of the hall with a quiet intensity, his presence commanding attention even before he appeared in the grand ballroom. Edmund Cavendish, known for his duels, wealth, and cold reputation, now carried himself with an unmistakable softness in his gaze when it lingered upon Eleanor. He had observed her growth, her resilience, and the dignified manner in which she had reclaimed her place in society. Yet beneath the composure and tradition-bound etiquette, he felt an exhilaration previously unknown, a desire to proclaim, to protect, and to honor the woman who had altered the landscape of his heart in mere seconds. As the ballroom doors opened, the orchestra's strings swelled with anticipation, each note weaving through the chandelier's prisms like a liquid of light and expectation. The guests, dressed in the finest silks and velvets, paused, sensing that the entrance of Lady Eleanor Whitmore was no ordinary moment. She glided forward with measured elegance, her eyes momentarily meeting those of her aunt, who offered a faint, proud smile. And then, from across the room, the Duke's gaze found her. In an instant, the world of scrutiny, judgment, and whispered scandal fell away, leaving only two souls suspended in a space of recognition, understanding, and quiet awe. The murmurs of society grew faint as the Duke approached, each step deliberate, carrying the weight of intention and admiration. He halted before Eleanor, his posture respectful yet infused with urgency, as if every second of delay might allow propriety to overshadow truth. "Lady Eleanor," he began, his voice steady yet rich with unspoken emotion, "for 10 years, the world has been careless with you, blind to the measure of your spirit, the depth of your courage, and the grace that endures in spite of judgment." The room seemed to lean in, drawn to the gravity of his words, though few could fully grasp the personal meaning contained within them. Eleanor, her composure intact, inclined her head with dignity, her voice soft but unwavering. "Your Grace, I have lived with the weight of society's whispers and the memory of past missteps. Yet I have learned to walk with the dignity that remains when all else is stripped away. I stand here not for their approval, but because the work we do matters beyond the gaze of spectators." Her words, though restrained, carried a resonance that silenced doubt, commanding attention not through flamboyance, but through integrity. The Duke's expression softened, and for the first time in public, he allowed the world to see the depth of feeling he had carefully concealed. Slowly, deliberately, he sank to one knee, his gloved hand extended toward Eleanor, a gesture both ancient in tradition and revolutionary in its intimacy. "For 10 years, England has forgotten you," he intoned, each syllable deliberate, heavy with sincerity. "For 10 years, I have believed myself immune to sentiment, to the charms of beauty and intellect alike. And yet in 20 seconds, a single moment, you have undone every certainty I held. Let it be known, here now, before the world that doubted you, that the woman who stands before me commands my admiration, my attention, and my devotion." Gasps and whispers rippled through the assembly. The Queen, seated on her dais, inclined her head subtly, a faint smile of acknowledgment gracing her visage. Eleanor, though taken aback by the public declaration, felt the embers of courage ignite fully within her. She extended her hand toward the Duke, a simple gesture of acceptance, yet one that carried the weight of her agency, her choice, and the unspoken acknowledgment of her own worth. The contact of their hands was electric, subtle yet profound, a bridge between the private intimacy of previous encounters and the public acknowledgment of affection and respect. "Your Grace," Eleanor began, her voice trembling slightly with emotion, "I have endured the shadows, the whispers, and the scorn of a society that delights in diminishing women such as I. And yet, in your regard, I have glimpsed a truth that defies all fear, all judgment. I stand not merely as the beneficiary of your admiration, but as a woman who has reclaimed herself, and in doing so, I choose to step into the light, with you, with purpose, and with courage." Her words, measured and deliberate, silenced any lingering murmur of gossip, replacing it with awe and reflection. The Duke rose, a subtle but undeniable tremor of relief crossing his features. He offered his arm, not as a formal escort, but as a covenant of mutual respect, admiration, and the tentative beginnings of love. Together, they moved to the center of the ballroom, where the orchestra resumed with a delicate waltz. Their dance was slow, deliberate, and laden with meaning, each step a testament to the journey from isolation to recognition, from whispered shame to celebrated presence. Guests observed with fascination, some leaning toward scandal, others leaning toward admiration. Yet Eleanor and Edmund moved as though the room had ceased to exist, their focus entirely upon one another. Every glance, every gentle touch, every whispered word was a continuation of the dialogue that had begun weeks prior, a narrative of trust, courage, and a gradual awakening of hearts long constrained by expectation and fear. As the night drew on, candlelight flickered against the polished surfaces of the grand hall, casting long shadows that intertwined with their own. Eleanor, glancing up at the Duke, noted a softness in his expression that belied his formidable reputation. He, in turn, observed her with a reverence and awe that spoke of admiration not merely for beauty or poise, but for resilience, intellect, and an unyielding spirit. In that ballroom, amid the whispers, glances, and formalities of society, they had carved a space for authenticity, connection, and a profound intimacy of mutual recognition. By the time the evening concluded, Eleanor understood that the past decade of solitude, whispers, and marginalization had been but a prelude to this moment. The Duke had not merely acknowledged her presence. He had honored her existence, her choices, and her agency. She had reclaimed her narrative, not through rebellion or confrontation, but through courage, composure, and the unspoken power of enduring with grace. As they stepped onto the balcony to witness the first tendrils of dawn brushing the English sky, Eleanor felt the weight of history, society, and expectation lift slightly, replaced by the fragile, exhilarating promise of a future shaped not by rumor, but by choice, respect, and the awakening of love. The narrator's voice lingers, reflective yet certain. In a world that had so long dismissed her, Eleanor Whitmore had been seen, acknowledged, and celebrated. The Duke of Ravensshire, for all his fearsome renown, had allowed himself to be moved, to be vulnerable, and to honor the woman who had endured the silence of years. Their journey was far from ordinary, yet in the quiet triumph of recognition and mutual regard, a new chapter had begun, one that would be remembered not for scandal, but for courage, dignity, and the enduring power of love's quiet insistence.